For our final chapter, we're going to be talking about sleep and dreams. Sleeping is something that is ubiquitous. We find it everywhere. It is an area that at all levels of the animal kingdom that we see evidence of sleep. Basically anything with the nervous system sleeps. Yet our understanding of what exactly is occurring in sleep, why we need sleep, is not well understood. The psychology of sleep is even less understood than the physiology. And when we start talking dreams, we're really moving out into a territory that psychology has never really been able to fully explore or explain. So for as widespread and important as these concepts are, this is really sort of a cutting edge area, particularly in the field of neuroscience and biology of behavior, where there's a lot of room for exploration and a lot of room for research. The main issue that we have with sleep is that the world is a very scary place. There are many things out there that are designed to attack you, to eat you, to steal from you, to harm you in many possible ways. When we look at the animal kingdom and the kinds of things the animals do to protect themselves with claws, with scales, with armor, with teeth, with strength, with size, with camouflage, we don't see a lot of that in humans. So what do we do to protect ourselves? Well, we come up with ways of creating our own claws, our own armor, our own camouflage, but we do that by using our minds, our wits. Pretty much the only thing that protects us from a world that wants to eat us and take our things is our wits, our minds, our brains, our focus, our cognitive abilities. So why then do we shut this off for 7 to 8 hours a night? This seems an incredibly dangerous thing to do, right? In fact, there's some early theories of sleep was that it was a form of, adaptive inactivity where we just curl up into a ball and we don't move at night so that we're harder to find, we're harder to eat, right? But this is ridiculous. We're so vulnerable. We're not even aware or cognizant. Things could come up upon us, right? Sleep has to be doing something other than just pure inactivity, right? So we must need sleep in a way that helps us survive despite the ramifications of losing our intellectual and cognitive ability for long periods of a time. Right? So why do we sleep? Well, that's one of the big questions I want to ask in this unit. Right? What is the purpose of sleep? Why do we do it? Do we really need it? What happens if we don't get it? If we look at sleep needs in general, you'll find that on average, most adults get about 7 to 7.25 hours of sleep a night and feel rested for it. A certain percentage will want to get more sleep and require a higher sleep need, upwards of 10 to 12 hours, and some people might be able to get sleep for only 4.5 hours a night and feel perfectly rested. But the percentage of people who need only 4.5 hours or 10.5 hours is very small. Right? In fact, when we look at this distribution, this is a highly cretotic distribution, which means that the point is really, really high, right? That there's not a lot of breadth in it, which tells us that a huge percentage of the population needs somewhere between 6.5 and 8.5 hours of sleep. Right? We have the vast majority of us are well within a narrow range of sleep, with most of us being at that 7 to 7.5 hour mark. Our sleep needs do change substantially over time. Right? From conception, there is evidence in the later stages of birth that the fetus actually does an action similar to sleep. Once we are born, we will spend between 16 to 18 hours a day sleeping. This is not a terribly deep sleep. This is actually a very light sleep, something that we call REM sleep, or that which we will talk about here in a little bit. There's not a lot of restful sleep going on here. So something else is happening with this type of sleep that we'll cover in a bit. But very rapidly, by the time we approach 10 years of age, and by the time we start entering puberty, our sleep needs are down right around that 7.5 to 8 hours of sleep. As we get older, our sleep needs do tend to reduce somewhat, but not nearly the same rate that we see earlier in age. What determines whether or not we need sleep in any given moment is based on two primary biological systems. The first is what we call the circadian rhythm, which is the 24-hour cycle of our bodies that tells us when it's time to be awake, when it's time to be asleep, when it's time to eat, when it's time to rest, when it's time to be active, right? All of these, the circadian rhythm does more than just tell us when to be asleep. It modulates all activities of our metabolism, action, and attention on a 24-hour clock. The homeostatic sleep need is determined by when it was the last time that you got sleep. So the longer it has been since you slept last, the higher your homeostatic sleep need. Right? So the homeostatic sleep need drives that sense of tiredness that is due to simply being awake, whereas the circadian rhythm drives that sense of tiredness that can emerge because it is time for you to sleep. Our bodies and minds tend to do best when their circadian rhythm and the homeostatic sleep need align. So when we are sleeping at the same time that our circadian rhythms say we should be sleeping, right? If you stay up for 24 hours, right, your homeostatic sleep need will be so strong you could probably fall asleep at any time you want. You fall asleep in the middle of the afternoon. But your circadian rhythm is still telling you it's time to be awake, it's time to be alert, it's time to be doing things. But your homeostatic sleep need overrides that. If this occurs consistently, such that you are sleeping during a time period in which your circadian rhythm says you should not be sleeping, it tends to stress the body out. This is why things like shift work, where you might be awake for long periods of time, or you might shift from a night to a day. If you work a job that is not aligned with circadian rhythms, or are not able to create a consistent pattern, it tends to stresses the body out, leads to increased risk of stroke, heart attack, and fatigue-related cognitive declines. Right? This is why when we travel and we experience jet lag, a huge part of jet lag is that shift in circadian rhythm. Right? Where our internal clock is telling us it's a different time than the external clock. Right? And that's, evidence of the importance of sleep, right? And when it doesn't align, it really stresses the body out. Not all people's circadian rhythms move smoothly, right? We can have disorders of the circadian rhythm. The two most common disorders of circadian rhythms are delayed sleep phase and advanced sleep phase. In delayed sleep phase, your circadian rhythms tells you that you want to be asleep from early morning until early afternoon, like an 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. Delayed sleep phase individuals are ones that often get that second wave late in the evenings. They might be a little bit tired, but then they get that second wave and often report being their most creative and their most focused in those early morning hours. And if left to their own devices, will not go to bed until 4 a.m. and want to sleep until noon. This is most common in teenagers and younger children. But this can be something that extends throughout your whole entire life. Advanced sleep phase is the reverse of this. These are people whose sleep phase in the circadian rhythm is activated in the afternoon and sleeps till the early morning hours. This is more common in elderly individuals, but is possible to occur at any stage of life. Whereas the normal sleep phase has us going to bed somewhere around 10 or 11 and waking up around 8 a.m. This is the majority of people's circadian rhythm clock, and that's why our society tends to run on that clock. So there's nothing inherently wrong with the delayed or advanced sleep phase cycle, other than it doesn't match everyone else's sleep phase cycle, so you tend to be constantly trying to force yourself into a sleep pattern to fit society that doesn't match your internal rhythms, and that stresses the body out. There are a couple of other far rarer circadian rhythm disorders, such as the irregular sleep-wake cycle, which are people who struggle to stay asleep for longer than a couple hours. And if left to their own devices, will probably sleep for a couple of hours 4 or 5 times a day. Right, in sort of longer naps. And then the non-24 hour are people whose circadian rhythm is not 24 hours. It might be 23 or 25 hours. What this means is that their sleep and wake cycles shift by an hour every single day, cycling through a normal phase, into a delayed phase, into an advanced phase, and back into the delayed phase again. All of us are subject to a bit of a slip in our circadian rhythm, right? It's not perfect. The body needs a way of sort of setting a 0 hour in the circadian rhythm and relies heavily on light. There's something called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which activates in response to exposure to sunlight, particularly blue wave light. When you get a massive burst of exposure of blue wave light, like for example going out into the sun, the suprachiasmatic nucleus resets the circadian rhythm clock. This is one reason why exposure to blue wave light can be very dangerous during non-waking hours, such as with cell phones. If we're looking at cell phones, looking at TVs, looking at computers, and getting that massive burst of blue wave light late at night, our suprachiasmatic nucleus is telling our brain, wait a minute, we need to reset the circadian clock, while our homeostatic sleep need and other biological functions are saying, no, it's bedtime. And this can actually disrupt sleep and cause stress. And this broader idea comes into something that we call sleep hygiene, which is how we can care for our sleep and maximize our sleep and its return. There are many things we can do to make it easier to fall asleep, and many things we can do to make it difficult to fall asleep. Things like comfort and temperature and food consumption, exposure to light, stress, caffeine. All of these things can reduce our ability to fall asleep, right? Whereas avoiding food, avoiding caffeine 3 to 4 hours before bed, avoiding alcohol before bed, exercise well before bed, right? You don't want to do it right before bed, but you want to give your body that 3 or 4 hours before falling asleep to stop the things that would normally keep us awake, such as exercise, food, and caffeine. Alcohol definitely is included in that as well. Though some people think that alcohol helps them fall asleep, alcohol actually disrupts the sleep. So it may make you feel like you fell asleep or fell asleep easier, but the quality of sleep you get is dramatically reduced. So by avoiding all those things that keep us awake and instituting patterns and relaxation in those hours before bed, we can maximize both the ability to fall asleep, stay asleep, and the quality sleep that we get. In fact, one of the primary recommendations in people suffering with sleep problems, particularly falling asleep, is to analyze their use of their bed. Many people use their bed as a generic furniture. They may lay on it to surf the internet, to read, to watch TV, to talk. Right? They're using their bed as a generic piece of furniture for everything but sleep. So then when it's time to go to sleep, you get on your bed, your brain and your body have been conditioned to treat the bed as a place to read or watch TV or surf the internet, and your brain's not activating sleep. Whereas if you only use your bed for sleep, right, you're only going in your bed for sleep, when you lay down in your bed, your brain goes, aha, it's time for sleep. As one sleep researcher told me at a conference, the bed should only be used for 2 things, and one of them is sleep. And I will leave the second one up to your imagination. Once we fall asleep, we don't just drift into a binary state of asleep and then wake up. There are different stages of sleep. Right? We tend to talk about them in terms of stage 1, stage 2, deep sleep, and REM sleep. Sometimes stage 1 and stage 2 are combined into a single stage called light sleep. We can actually see these in EEG patterns, all right? And what we're looking for deep sleep are these large synchronous waves that tell us that the brain is kind of syncing up in a slow wave state, right? Whereas in light sleep, we have much more active brain activity that slowly becomes bigger and more synchronized as we fall into sleep. REM is much more short active, a lot of brain activity going on here, and you can compare that to a relaxed or waking state. All right. So when we fall asleep, we tend to initially fall into a deep sleep cycle. Then we have short REM cycles early in the night, followed by long deep sleep cycles. But as the night wears on, we fall less and less into deep sleep and spend more and more time in REM sleep, where by the end of our sleeping cycle, we're spending almost all of our time in REM. REM is referred to as rapid eye movement, which is if you look at somebody's eyes while they're sleeping, you can actually see their pupils going back and forth really quickly. It's actually quite dramatic. And if you live with somebody and they're falling asleep, you might be able to look at their eyes, and if you look closely at their eyelids, you can see the eyes going back and forth, back and forth. It can be quite dramatic. If you don't live with anybody, maybe a neighbor leaves a window open and you can sneak in at night. No. Don't do that. Never mind. I didn't suggest that. No, I mean, even dogs, pets, cats, you can see this in, right? REM is important because we know it is the state that is most closely linked to dreaming. Whereas with non-REM, we don't see the rapid eye movement, and this is much more closely related to the deep sleep or the light sleep, and we don't see much in the way of dreaming during the non-REM sleep. So we can really divide sleep into 2 primary categories, non-REM and REM, We can divide non-REM into light sleep and deep sleep, but cognitively speaking, right, there's fairly similar. There's more brain activity in light sleep than there is in deep sleep. But really, non-REM and REM is where we tend to draw the major division points in sleep.